I often discuss the many dangers associated with hydraulic fracturing or fracking. From artificial earthquakes to sinkholes, there's mounting evidence that proves that the environmental risks posed by fracking far outweigh its net energy benefit. Now, you might also be familiar with the liquid that's used for fracking, a chemical cocktail used to break down rocks to help with the drilling. Well, this same liquid has been found to be associated with a whole host of adverse health effects all across the country. Now, adding to these concerns is the practice of offshore fracking. In the case of California, federal authorities have granted permits to oil rig operators to dump billions of gallons of fracking waste into the Pacific Ocean every year. But this license to pollute isn't sitting too well with environmental activists who have recently filed a legal petition urging the federal government to establish restrictions on this horrible practice. So join me now to break down what the effects of this toxic waste are and what exactly the new petition is calling for. I'm joined by RT correspondent Ramon Galindo. Thanks so much for coming on, Ramon.
Good to be here, Abby.
So first of all, tell me exactly what this fracking waste consists of and how much of it's ending up in the ocean every year.
Sure. Well, one of the big problems, Abby, is that people don't know what is inside of these of this fracking waste. These oil companies aren't supposed, or they haven't been disclosing the type of chemicals in here, and there really hasn't been any sort of long-term study on the negative effects that it's having on the marine life. However, the EPA, they do regulate what is dumped into the water. Technically, offshore oil rigs are not supposed to be dumping anything into the water unless you have a permit. Now, this is a copy of the permit which allows tons of different fluids to be dumped into the ocean. They include domestic and sanitary waste, blowout preventer fluid, and according to the Center for Biological Diversity, there's also fracking waste being dumped into the ocean. So right now what they're trying to do is make sure that these offshore drillers aren't allowed to dump any of this waste, and they're really challenging the EPA to look into these negative effects that they're having on human and animal life.
So you're saying that as it stands right now, the EPA is not really assessed. Well, first of all, we don't really know exactly what's being dumped, and second of all, the EPA has not assessed actually any sort of effects environmentally of the dumping into the ocean, correct?
Right. Well, the reports are that offshore fracking has been going on for decades, but really this disposal has been going on under the radar. It wasn't even really up until the last couple of years that journalists uncovered that this was going on, that environmentalists and regulators have really taken a close look at this. I mean, California regulators were taken aback at the fact that any of this was going on in the very environmentally sensitive Santa Barbara channel there. Now, there are limits to the type of things that are dumped off of these offshore oil rigs. You can't dump oil, you can't dump diesel, and even the fracking fluid that is dumped does have to be treated, and it goes under strict monitoring. If it's under a certain toxicity level, it is allowed, but if it's too toxic, then it does have to be dumped. It is not allowed to be dumped into the ocean.
Well, I'll tell you, Roman, I don't really trust even what they say is, you know, just toxic enough to dump. But I mean, really quickly explain how it works, because I think we know about offshore drilling, I guess, for oil, but I've never even heard of offshore fracking.
Right, it's a relatively new thing. Fracking's been going on for a few decades. This offshore fracking, according to the American Petroleum Institute, started during the 90s, and really it takes a lot more sand. They say that it's better because it uses less water, but at the end of the day, they're dumping a lot of the waste right back into the ocean. So that really brings up a lot of new questions as to what sort of harm is being done, and that's why these environmental groups are really taking a closer look and challenging the EPA to look into these harmful effects.
So right now, just go over this one more time with me. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit confused. So right now, what agreement does the government have with these companies to legally dump this waste in the ocean?
Right now, the EPA, they have these contracts that exempt them from the Safe Drinking Water Act, because the Safe Drinking Water Act, or the Safe Water Act, excuse me, doesn't allow for any dumping. But if you get an exemption, then you get to dump certain fluids that are approved. This fracking waste is one of them, but it does have to meet a certain toxicity level. And they have set this limit according to the analysis from the Center of Biological Diversity that says that they can dump up to 9 billion gallons of this waste every year.
Wonderful. That's extremely comforting. You know, Ramon, I guess the next question is, why dump it in the ocean? I mean, is there really nothing else that can be done with the liquid waste here?
Right. Well, it does seem like a very poor place to put it, but when you think about the alternative, it's equally as dangerous. If it is too toxic to dump into the ocean, then it has to be shipped onshore and put into injection wells. Now, these injection wells are really a source of great controversy because it's been linked to contamination of water systems. A lot of proponents of fracking say that it is a safe practice and that it hasn't been the drilling technique itself hasn't been proven to be dangerous to the environment. However, several studies, including government studies, have proven that these injection wells are very dangerous to water systems.
What a nightmare. Well, you know, you're in LA. The Los Angeles City Council recently voted in favor of a moratorium on fracking. I mean, that's pretty huge. Can you tell us about the circumstances that led up to this vote? And do you think the decision will make a larger impact outside of just LA?
Sure. Well, there were activists that were really celebrating, but at the same time, they're very cautious. What happened last week is that the City Council unanimously voted to move forward with a moratorium on fracking here in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is home to the largest urban oil fields in the United States. And so now the city attorney has to come up with an ordinance that would completely prohibit the practice here in Los Angeles. But we have to remember that it doesn't prohibit it in the surrounding communities where fracking still happens. And there are several other counties here in California that still use the practice. In the last year, there was an attempt to completely ban fracking throughout the state of California, but the energy lobby, along with lawmakers here, are still very much in favor of exploiting our oil and gas resources, whether it's on land or whether it's in the water. So they did pass a law which requires oil companies to report where they're drilling and to report some of the chemicals, but it really doesn't go far enough, according to some activists who say that the legislation was watered way down compared to when they wanted to ban fracking completely.
And of course, Jerry Brown is very big proponent of fracking. I mean, let's really quickly talk about the petition. What are they hoping to achieve with it, and what are the next steps? We have about a minute left.
Sure. Well, under this petition that was filed by the Center of Biological Diversity, they're trying to get the EPA to either amend or completely revoke this contract, which allows these offshore oil rigs, there's 23 of them out there in the Santa Barbara Channel, which are allowed to dump these fluids out into the ocean. So it's up to the EPA. There are provisions in the contract that say that if it is found to be harmful to human or to animal life, that they can revoke these contracts. So they're really challenging the EPA to take a look at it. I called the EPA to get their response and to ask them where they got this number that it's allowable to dump 9 billion gallons of waste into the ocean. I'm still waiting to hear back from them, and the center's still waiting to hear back from them as well.
Thank you so much, Ramon Galindo. Appreciate it.
You bet. Hydraulic fracturing or fracking has caused heated debate on land. And now opponents of fracking are taking their fight to the Pacific Ocean. Environmentalists have filed a legal petition with the EPA in hopes of preventing oil companies from dumping fracking fluid into the ocean.
The Center for Biological Diversity this week filed a petition with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to either modify or revoke a permit that the EPA recently revised. And this permit is a pollution discharge permit.
Currently, oil producers in federal waters can dump up to 9 billion gallons of wastewater into the ocean every year.
These are oil platforms that are operating in the Santa Barbara Channel off our coast. It's the site of some of the richest wildlife habitat on our coast.
Fracking is an extraction method which involves injecting water, sand, and chemicals into undersea shale and sand formations. Some of the fluid is treated and then dumped into the ocean.
We don't know what's in this mix, and that's one of the big problems. There is some information from other wells offshore in California that have used chemicals like Exide. This is a carcinogen that is also an ecological hazard.
The oil industry maintains that hydraulic fracturing is safe, saying that it has been done millions of times on land. An investigation by Truthout helped shed light on fracking off the California coast.
Because more fracking could happen in the future as oil and gas development continues in the Monterey Shale, environmentalists are worried that this sets a bad precedent.
The Monterey Shale runs from Los Angeles to San Francisco and may hold billions of barrels of hard-to-reach oil. The industry argues that new oil and gas exploration will help the economy, but environmental groups don't think it's worth the risk.
By convincing the EPA to stop this discharge, this dumping of fracking chemicals into our ocean here in California, we may be able to have a national impact.
Many policymakers in California remain in favor of exploiting the state's oil and gas reserves, whether it's onshore or offshore. Till that changes, environmentalists will keep fighting to keep the fracking fluid out of the water. In Los Angeles, Ramon Galindo, RT.
Bienvenidos todos. I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. You know, sometimes there's a story that just defines hypocrisy. One is how Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg bought out his neighboring mansion so he could have some privacy. Never mind the millions of Facebook users whose personal data is sold off to vulture businesses. Another is a story that broke just a few days ago. See, Exxon is the largest natural gas producer in the U.S., and if you've been following the downward spiral of U.S. energy consumption, you know that the government and big energy are pushing hard for fracking all across the country. But don't you dare frack on Exxon's CEO's Rex Tillerson's yard. See, this millionaire scumbag thinks it's perfectly okay to poison the planet with toxic pollution at the hands of his precious business, but as soon as his pristine landscape gets scarred, well, that's just not acceptable. See, Tillerson and his rich neighbors have filed a lawsuit in an attempt to shut down a fracking project that's just a little too close to his Texas mansion. And they're petitioning the town to block a tower that would provide water for fracking because of how much of an eyesore it would be. In the suit, they actually go as far as claiming it's illegal. It would create a noise nuisance and traffic hazards. Interestingly enough, Mr. Tillerson's day job is literally to debunk the same claims he's making in the lawsuit and to promote hydraulic fracturing, a practice that has already been proven to cause earthquakes and birth defects at the very least. In fact, Tillerson has even gone as far as saying that those who oppose and try to regulate fracking are, quote, holding back the American economic recovery, growth, and global competitiveness. Wow. I find it absolutely fascinating that CEOs and politicians find it perfectly acceptable to completely strip the environment, toxify the land, and poison the air as long as it's someone else's land, someone else's family, someone else's life. I'm just waiting for Tillerson to set his own PR machine against himself. After all, he wouldn't want to be accused of holding back the growth of America, would he? Now let's break the set.